It seems all very confusing. Is there a bubble? Or is there not a bubble? What's up everyone, Conrad Neufeld here, and today we're talking about whether or not there is a Canadian housing bubble. Here's a spoiler for you. I don't think there is one. But we're also going to be talking about 5 things that you can do to protect yourself in this kind of real estate environment. And some of these will apply to you if you're looking to buy a home currently or if you already own a home. And here's the best part. These recommendations don't require me to be a fortune teller. Whether I'm right or wrong on this whole housing bubble thing, if you follow these suggestions, you will still come out ahead. So let's first talk about whether there's a housing bubble. If you rewind a bit and you go back to the first quarter of 2020, there was a lot of people predicting the end of times for the real estate market, that coronavirus was somehow going to bring the real estate market down to its knees. And yet, during that time, I didn't have a YouTube channel at the time, I was one of the very few voices telling our realtor partners that I was actually predicting prices were going to go up slightly. Now, I got the direction right in the sense that housing prices went up, I just got the severity wrong. I only thought they were going to climb slightly, not as significantly as they have. You see, in my head, as counterintuitive as it seemed to most, I thought it was logical that prices would actually see an increase. You've got an environment where, because of uncertainty and a pandemic, people are not wanting to buy and move. After all, maybe the job that they're moving for isn't going to be there by the time they get there. So what that really means is that the only people who are going to buy are the ones who absolutely need to buy, or so the mainstream predictions would go. And if you sit on that for a bit, really there's 2 conclusions that you can draw. Number 1, the government doesn't want deflation, so they're going to do everything in their power to try to stimulate economic activity. In this case, they're going to roll out quantitative easing, which no one could have predicted that they were going to roll out quite as much as they did. All governments around the world did it. And they're going to lower the interest rate, both of which will support higher Canadian housing prices. But the second, more important factor I was considering was the flip side of the coin of buying, and that's selling. If every single homeowner out there is thinking to themselves, there is no one out there buying, and that's echoed by relentless articles predicting dropping housing prices, then there's not a single home builder or homeowner thinking, now is the perfect time to sell my property. And as a result, supply shrinks. Market sentiment is a powerful thing. So logically, I was thinking that yes, demand was going to drop, but that supply was going to drop by slightly more than demand, resulting in a slight increase in prices. As it played out though, with the economic stimulus and the drop in interest rates, demand didn't really go anywhere. But supply did. Supply didn't even come close to keeping up with the demand. Naturally, housing prices did rise like I predicted, but significantly more than I was anticipating. Now the real question is, did this lack of supply and overpaced demand really cause a housing bubble? And to answer that, we need a bit more context, because the truth is the housing price increase did not affect uniformly every asset class, and it certainly didn't affect uniformly from province to province. Meaning that condos weren't affected in the same way that single-family homes were, and that single-family homes in, say, Saskatoon and Alberta weren't affected the same way that single-family homes in Montreal or Toronto or Greater Vancouver were affected. If you look at the prairies, for instance, there are very few people worried about a bubble, and here's why. Let's take a look at Calgary, Edmonton, Regina, and Saskatoon. If we use the MLS Home Price Index, which allows us to measure the changes of home prices over time, you can see that there was a run-up of home prices before the 2008 crash, and that some markets were affected sooner than later. What followed in each of those markets, though, was a very flat decade. Now, you can see that some markets have increases in home prices in 2021, but nowhere close enough to be concerned about a bubble. And if you throw in Winnipeg for good measure, you can see that maybe they're a bit overpriced, but you're more likely to see flat home prices for a while rather than a significant drop in prices. But let's be serious. When the media is talking about a Canadian housing bubble, they're not really talking about a housing bubble in Canada. What they're really talking about is a housing bubble in the larger cities within Canada. So let's look at the Greater Toronto and Greater Vancouver areas. What you'll quickly see is something else is going on entirely, and it's not just the effects from the pandemic. Home prices have been rapidly increasing in these markets for quite some time, long before COVID was even a thing. And if you take a mean regression based off 2005 to 2015, that's 10 years worth of data, it looks something like this. When you look at that, yeah, home prices look overpriced. But if you look closer, you'll actually notice that there was a shift in the mean regression line, starting near the end of 2015. Something happened that set these markets off on a whole different course, and that something was a fiscally loose government. Now, this is not to get political. It is well known that Justin Trudeau lacks the financial experience that previous governments have had, both conservative and liberal. Money is just not his strong suit. And in this case, his policies and government spending have had some adverse effects on housing prices in certain Canadian markets. If we look at Montreal, for example, you'll see the same thing. Housing prices were rising long before COVID had an impact. The trajectory of housing prices changed after the election. They just continued after COVID. You'll see the same thing in Ottawa as well. So what does this all mean? It means that likely this is not a bubble, and that a majority of these housing price gains are actually based on fundamentals. Now, that doesn't mean that in certain markets we're not going to see a small correction in prices, particularly if supply overcorrects. It's just unlikely that we won't see a bubble pop. So, what should we do? Number one, don't buy speculatively. Buying with the hopes that you're going to somehow ride this never-ending appreciation curve is not only a bad idea, it's stupid investing. If you're buying your own place to live, ask yourself, can you see yourself living there in the next 5 to 10 years? And if the answer is yes, that's great. But if the answer is no, really ask yourself what your motivations are for buying that place. And if you're buying a real estate investment, ask yourself, does this property cash flow well? If the answer is yes, great. And if the answer is no, what the hell are you doing? Every real estate investment that you purchase should cash flow. Fight back that FOMO, that fear of missing out. Some people feel like because homes have appreciated so much that they've somehow missed the boat. Don't worry, you haven't missed anything at all. Number two, don't overbid on a house. I've had a lot of my clients just even recently lose out on some bidding wars, and I stayed true to this. Now, sometimes real estate agents in certain markets will price their homes well under market value to purposely create a bidding war situation, because sometimes they end up getting a larger house price than they would have if they had just priced it at market value right off the bat. Not only that, it's a great marketing tool because they can go to their next client and they can say, well, the last house I sold for $300,000 over asking price. If the bidding war is anything other than this scenario, which often requires a lot of intimate knowledge of the market to know if that's the case, don't engage in the bidding war. For starters, it means you're going to need a lot more cash, as mortgage lenders aren't going to lend higher than the appraised value. Any difference between where you're buying it at, that purchase price, and what this thing will appraise for will have to be covered in cash, and none of that will contribute towards your down payment. Secondly, if you overbid, it will take the market some time to catch up to the price that you overbid it to support the actual value that you gave it. So in the long term, you'll likely realize the equity in your place. In the meantime, though, you're in a situation where if you have to sell your place, you're probably going to do it at a loss. Number three, don't make offers without conditions. And it can be tempting to do this sometimes because you may even have a real estate agent telling you, we'll never get the house unless we put an unconditional offer in on this place. But unless you're sitting on enough cash to cover the full purchase price of the home, know that financing is never guaranteed. And just because the market's going crazy doesn't mean that you should be skipping some important steps, like the condition of finance. In fact, especially when the market is going crazy, that's precisely when you should be making sure you don't skip any of the important steps. Number four, don't try to time the market. Now is not the time to sell if you weren't already thinking about selling. Now is not the time to buy if you weren't already thinking about buying. I have never met anyone who's ever been able to consistently and effectively time the market. Real estate is a long-term play. Consider it with a long-term plan. Just as an example, I heard a stat the other day that commercial real estate in downtown Vancouver doubles about every 5 years. And it's been doubling every 5 years for over the last 100 years. Now, for the last few decades, many people have been calling it out, claiming it to be a bubble. If you were trying to time that market, you probably sold decades ago and never bought back in. Number five, don't overborrow for securities. Over time, real estate assets do appreciate in value, but there are still natural up and down cycles that occur within them. Just because we're not in a bubble doesn't mean we won't see some small price corrections in certain markets. Refinancing your current home to consolidate debts or increasing the value of your home equity line of credit now that your home appraises for more aren't necessarily bad plans. They can actually go a long way in increasing your safety net. But if you're taking that extended home equity line of credit and you're putting it into riskier investments, an economic downturn hits you twice as hard. Not only did you lose your investment, but you now have a load of debt to show for it.